The empath is not born weak. The empath is trained, conditioned, programmed. And the programming usually starts in childhood, the moment a child learns that love is only available when they stop thinking about themselves. That's the hidden truth almost nobody talks about. Most empaths are not too emotional. They are children who became emotional surveillance systems. They learned to scan faces, monitor tones, predict danger, and absorb tension before it exploded. They became experts at reading people because their nervous system believed survival depended on it. And here's where it gets disturbing. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. The brain becomes obsessed with detecting emotional shifts in other people. Studies on childhood emotional neglect show that children raised in unpredictable environments often develop heightened sensitivity to facial expressions, body language, and emotional energy. Their brains adapt for protection, not peace. That child grows up believing one dangerous lie. If I take care of everyone else first, maybe I'll finally be safe. So the empath becomes the listener, the healer, the fixer, the emotional sponge, the one who says it's okay while silently drowning inside because selfishness was never allowed. Think about it carefully. Healthy children naturally act selfish sometimes. They cry when they need attention. They demand comfort. They say no. They protect their toys. They express anger openly. That is normal nervous system development. But in dysfunctional environments, selfishness becomes dangerous. The child learns. Don't upset mom. Don't trigger dad. Don't ask for too much. Don't become a burden. Don't make your emotions bigger than theirs. So instead of developing identity, they develop emotional adaptation. This is why so many empaths feel guilty resting. Guilty saying no. Guilty prioritizing themselves. Guilty charging money. Guilty walking away from toxic people. Their nervous system confuses self-protective. On with abandonment. And the terrifying part is this. The world rewards them for it. People praise empaths for being kind, selfless, always there, the strong one. But underneath that praise is often exhaustion, suppressed resentment, and emotional starvation. Research in neuroscience shows that chronic emotional suppression increases cortisol levels and activates prolonged stress responses inside the body. Over time, this affects sleep, digestion, immunity, memory, and even inflammation. The empath's body keeps score. That's why many empaths feel physically tired around certain people. Their nervous system never learned healthy emotional boundaries. It learned emotional merging. And toxic people can sense this instantly. Manipulators are drawn to empaths for one reason. Empaths were trained to abandon themselves. A narcissistic personality doesn't need your weakness. It needs your conditioning. It needs the version of you that feels responsible for fixing everybody. So the empath enters relationships where they overgive, overexplain, overforgive, and overstay. Not because they are stupid, but because their childhood taught them love must be earned through sacrifice. This is why an empath can detect lies in seconds, yet still stay with liars for years. Awareness without boundaries changes nothing. Now here's where things begin to shift. The moment an empath learns that self-care is not selfish, their entire identity starts collapsing and rebuilding at the same time. The empath was never supposed to become this emotionally exhausted. No child is born believing their needs are dangerous. That belief is taught. Slowly, quietly, repeatedly. And by the time the child grows up, the conditioning is so deep they mistake survival patterns for personality. Most people think empaths are simply sensitive people. But psychology tells a darker story. Many empaths are not naturally selfless by choice. They became hyper-aware because their nervous system adapted to emotional instability during childhood. Imagine being 6 years old and learning that the mood in the house controls your safety. One slammed door changes the atmosphere. One angry sigh changes your heartbeat. One cold silence from a parent feels like emotional abandonment. So your brain begins scanning everything. Facial expressions, tone shifts, footsteps, energy changes. You become emotionally alert before you even understand what anxiety is. Scientists call this hypervigilance. And research in developmental psychology shows that children raised in unpredictable emotional environments often develop overactive threat detection systems in the brain. The amygdala, the part responsible for fear and survival, becomes highly sensitive. The child learns to detect emotional danger before words are even spoken. That child grows up becoming the empath, not because they were weak, because they adapted. This is what most people never understand. The empath's gift often biga. And as a defense mechanism. Studies using brain imaging have shown that people exposed to chronic childhood stress can develop stronger emotional pattern recognition abilities. In simple terms, the brain becomes obsessed with reading people accurately because mistakes once carried emotional consequences. If mom was sad, you had to comfort her. If dad was angry, you had to disappear emotionally. If conflict started, you became the peacemaker. If tension filled the room, your nervous system absorbed it instantly. And over time, the child unconsciously learns one dangerous equation. My emotions matter less than everyone else's. That sentence alone destroys millions of people quietly, because when a child suppresses their own emotional needs long enough, they stop knowing who they are. Instead of developing identity, they develop adaptation. Instead of asking, "What do I feel?" they ask, "What does everybody else need from me?" That is not emotional maturity. That is survival condition. Ioning, and the terrifying part is how invisible it becomes. Teachers praise the child for being so mature. Relatives call them easy to handle. Friends say they are such a good listener. Nobody notices the child learn to disappear. Psychologists studying childhood emotional neglect discovered something disturbing. Children who are forced to emotionally monitor caregivers often become adults who feel responsible for everyone's emotional state. They carry guilt for problems they never created. They apologize for things that are not their fault. They absorb stress like a sponge absorbs water. And eventually the body starts collapsing under the pressure. Because emotions do not vanish when suppressed. They relocate into the nervous system. Research from stress physiology shows that chronic emotional suppression increases cortisol production, the body's primary stress hormone. Elevated cortisol over long periods is linked to anxiety, fatigue, digestive disorders, weakened immunity, insomnia, memory issues, and even cardiovascular disease. The empath's body remembers what the mind tries to normalize. That's why many empaths feel exhausted after social interaction. It's not imagination. Their nervous system has spent years operating in emotional survival mode. And here's where it becomes heartbreaking. Most empaths don't even realize they are neglecting themselves, because self-neglect feels normal to them. They learned early that love was earned through usefulness, through listening, through calming others down, through being low maintenance, through sacrificing their own feelings to keep peace in the environment. This creates what psychologists call fawning behavior, a trauma response where people prioritize pleasing others to avoid rejection, conflict, or emotional danger. Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The empath often becomes the fawner. They smile when hurt, agree when uncomfortable, stay silent when disrespected, forgive too quickly, explain constantly, and feel guilty for saying no, not because they are naturally weak, because their childhood taught them boundaries were unsafe, and toxic people can sense this instantly. Manipulative personalities are often drawn toward highly empathetic individuals because empaths are conditioned to overgive. The empath unconsciously believes love must be earned through emotional labor, so they become emotional caretakers for people who would never do the same for them, and the cycle repeats for years. What's even more disturbing is that many empaths can detect lies almost immediately. Studies on emotional intelligence suggest highly sensitive individuals often notice micro-expressions, tone inconsistencies, and behavioral shifts faster than average people. They can feel dishonesty, but they ignore it. Why? Because childhood conditioning taught them maintaining connection is more important than protecting themselves. That is why an empath can recognize toxicity and I'll stay. Their nervous system fears abandonment more than mistreatment. Now imagine living like this for decades. Constant emotional monitoring, constant overthinking, constant guilt, constant pressure to make everyone okay. Eventually, the empath begins losing connection with themselves entirely. And this creates one of the deepest psychological wounds imaginable. The inability to identify personal needs. Researchers studying attachment trauma discovered that emotionally neglected children often struggle as adults to answer simple questions like, "What do you enjoy? What do you need? What do you want from life?" because survival taught them to focus outward, not inward. Their emotional radar became so tuned into others that they stopped hearing themselves, and the world rewards them for it. People love the empath who never complains, the empath who always listens, the empath who sacrifices endlessly, the empath who stays calm under pressure. But nobody asks what it costs. DS them internally. Nobody sees the burnout, the panic attacks, the chronic exhaustion, the emotional numbness, the loneliness hidden behind kindness. And perhaps the saddest part of all is this: many empaths secretly believe their pain is proof they are loving correctly. But love was never supposed to require self-erasure. A healthy child learns that their needs matter too. A healthy nervous system learns balance. A healthy relationship allows emotional reciprocity. The empath never learned that. They learned survival through self-abandonment. But healing begins the moment they recognize the truth. The sensitivity was never the problem. The conditioning was. The child who learned to read every room, the teenager who became everybody's therapist, the adult who feels guilty resting, that person was not born broken. They were trained to survive emotionally unstable environments by becoming emotionally useful to everyone else. And once the empath understands that, everything changes. Because for the first time in their life, they stop asking, "How can I keep everybody happy?" And they finally ask the question their inner child has been waiting years to hear. What happens if I choose myself too? The empath does not break all at once. The collapse happens slowly, quietly, invisibly, one sacrifice at a time, one swallowed emotion at a time, one more yes when the soul is screaming no. And the terrifying part is this: most empaths believe their exhaustion is proof they are loving correctly. They confuse self-destruction with kindness. Psychologists have spent decades studying what happens when a person constantly prioritizes the emotional needs of others over their own. The results are alarming. Chronic people-pleasing and emotional suppression activate the body's stress response system continuously, flooding the nervous system with cortisol and adrenaline for extended periods. This is not just emotional pain. It becomes biological damage. Research from the American Psychological Association has linked long-term emotional stress to weakened immune function, memory impairment, digestive disorders, anxiety disorders, cardiovascular strain, and chronic fatigue. The body literally begins deteriorating under emotional overload. And empaths are especially vulnerable because they absorb emotions instead of processing them. Think about how dangerous that becomes over years. Every argument they internalize, every toxic relationship they tolerate, every moment they stay silent to keep peace, every betrayal they excuse, every emotional burden they carry that was never theirs to begin with. The nervous system keeps count even when the mind tries to minimize it. That's why so many empaths say strange things like, "I'm tired all the time, I feel drained after being around certain people, I need isolation to recover, I don't know why I feel emotionally heavy." Their body is screaming what their conditioning taught them to ignore. Studies on emotional labor show that constantly regulating emotions for the comfort of others can create severe psychological exhaustion. The brain consumes enormous energy trying to maintain emotional harmony, especially in individuals with heightened sensitivity. In other words, the empath's mind is working overtime almost every second, reading moods, predicting reactions, monitoring tension, avoiding conflict, managing other people's emotions. Even in silence, the empath is working, and most people never notice, because empaths rarely look broken externally. They smile while overwhelmed. They comfort others while collapsing internally. They become therapists for friends while secretly feeling emotionally starved themselves. This creates one of the most dangerous cycles in psychology: the overgiving trauma bond. The empath gives more. The toxic person takes more. The empath feels needed. The toxic person feels entitled. And eventually, the empath loses themselves completely. Research on narcissistic relationship dynamics shows that highly empathetic individuals are significantly more likely to remain in emotionally exploitative relationships because they prioritize understanding the abuser over protecting themselves. That sentence alone explains years of suffering for millions of people. The empath sees the wounded child inside the manipulator. They empathize with their trauma. They excuse their behavior. They keep hoping love will heal them. But toxic people often interpret empathy as permission. And the longer the empath stays, the more their nervous system deteriorates. One shocking study on chronic relational stress found that emotionally toxic environments can dysregulate the autonomic nervous system so severely that the body remains trapped in fight-or-flight mode for years. Imagine what that does to the brain. Sleep becomes unstable. Memory weakens. The immune system drops. Hormones become imbalanced. Inflammation increases throughout the body. The empath starts aging emotionally and physically at the same time, and yet they still blame themselves because childhood conditioning taught them this horrifying belief. If someone is hurting, it's my responsibility to help them, so they become addicted to rescuing people. Not because it feels good, because guilt feels unbearable otherwise. This is where empathy becomes self-abandonment, and society rewards it constantly. People praise the empath for being so giving, so patient, so understanding, the strongest person in the room. But strength without boundaries becomes self-destruction. The empath slowly becomes an emotional landfill for everyone else's unresolved pain. Friends vent to them constantly but rarely ask if they're okay. Partners rely on them emotionally but offer little support in return. Family members dump stress onto them because they know the empath will absorb it quietly. And eventually something inside the empath begins dying. Not loud. Lie. Silently. It starts with emotional numbness. Researchers studying burnout discovered that chronic emotional overextension can eventually reduce emotional responsiveness altogether. The brain essentially shuts down emotional sensitivity temporarily as a survival mechanism. That's why many empaths suddenly feel detached after years of overgiving. They are not becoming cold. Their nervous system is exhausted, and then comes the resentment. The dangerous resentment empaths rarely admit out loud. Because deep down, many empaths secretly feel angry that nobody gives back the way they do. But they feel guilty even thinking it. So instead of expressing the resentment, they suppress it further. And suppressed resentment often transforms into depression, anxiety, panic attacks, or physical symptoms. The body speaks what the mouth refuses to say. Some empaths develop chronic migraines. Others develop digestive disorders. Some experience insomnia. Others feel constant fatigue, no doc. Tor can fully explain. Trauma researchers now understand that emotional suppression does not simply disappear. The nervous system stores unresolved emotional stress inside the body. The body remembers every ignored boundary. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is this. Most empaths don't realize they are allowed to stop, allowed to say no, allowed to disappoint people, allowed to walk away, allowed to protect their peace. Because somewhere in childhood they learned love had conditions. Love required usefulness. Usefulness required sacrifice. Sacrifice required silence. So they built identities around endurance instead of authenticity. But healing begins the moment the empath realizes something revolutionary. Being needed is not the same as being loved. That truth changes everything. Because many relationships survive only because the empath keeps over-functioning emotionally. The moment the empath creates boundaries, unhealthy people become uncomfortable immediately. This reveals who truly valued them and who merely benefited from their self-abandonment. Psychologists call this boundary resistance. People accustomed to unlimited access often react negatively when limits appear. They may call the empath selfish, distant, dramatic, or changed. But in reality, the empath is finally becoming healthy. For the first time, they stop measuring love by suffering. And slowly, the nervous system begins recovering. Cortisol levels decrease. Sleep improves. Mental clarity returns. Energy stabilizes. Emotional balance reappears. The empath begins experiencing something unfamiliar. Peace without guilt. And that may be the hardest adjustment of all. Because after a lifetime of emotional chaos, peace feels unnatural at first. The empath was conditioned to believe love must be earned through exhaustion. But real love never demanded self-erasure. Real love does not punish boundaries. Real love does not feed on your empathy. Real love does not require why or to destroy yourself to prove loyalty. And maybe the most painful truth the empath must eventually face is this. No matter how much love you give, you cannot heal people who are committed to remaining harmful. You can understand someone's trauma without volunteering to become its next victim. That lesson changes the empath forever, because eventually they realize the people who truly love you will never demand access to your pain as proof of your devotion. And the moment the empath finally understands that, the cycle begins to break. The empath's healing does not begin with love, it begins with guilt, crushing guilt, the kind that appears the moment they finally try to choose themselves. One small boundary can feel terrifying: ignoring a message, saying no to a favor, walking away from emotional chaos, refusing to rescue someone again. To most people, these are normal actions. To the empath, they can feel like betrayal, because the empath was conditioned to believe their worth came from sacrifice. Somewhere in childhood, they learned that being needed was the safest way to stay loved. So when they stop overgiving, their nervous system reacts as if survival itself is under threat. And science proves this reaction is real. Studies in attachment psychology show that individuals raised with inconsistent emotional validation often develop anxious attachment patterns. Their brains become deeply wired to seek approval, avoid rejection, and maintain emotional connection at almost any cost. That means when an empath finally says, "No, I can't do this anymore, I need space, you hurt me," their body may respond with panic, heart racing, chest tightening, overthinking, spiraling out of control, not because the boundary is wrong, but because their nervous system associates boundaries with abandonment. This is why healing feels painful before it feels peaceful. The empath is not just changing behavior. They are rewiring survival programming. And that principle, what occasion can feel terrifying. Imagine spending your entire life believing your purpose was to hold everyone together. Then one day, you stop. Suddenly the phone becomes quieter. Certain people disappear. Some relationships become cold overnight. And for the first time, the empath sees something devastating. Many people love their usefulness more than their humanity. That realization breaks something deep inside. Psychologists call this role-based identity attachment. When someone builds self-worth entirely around helping others, they often lose connection with their authentic identity. They no longer know who they are outside of caregiving, fixing, or rescuing. That's why many empaths secretly fear boundaries. Because without constant emotional sacrifice, they feel invisible. The brain literally asks, "If I stop saving everyone, will anyone still love me?" And this fear keeps millions trapped in toxic cycles for decades. But something extraordinary happens the moment the empath begins tolerating discomfort instead of automatically rescuing others. The nervous system slowly recalibrates. Research on neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, shows that repeated behavioral changes can literally alter neural pathways over time. In simple terms, every healthy boundary teaches the brain a new lesson. I can protect myself and still survive. That sentence becomes revolutionary for the empath, because for years, survival meant self-abandonment. Now imagine the emotional shock of realizing you were allowed to have needs this entire time, allowed to rest, allowed to say no, allowed to leave toxic environments, allowed to stop explaining yourself, allowed to protect your peace without earning permission first. Many empaths cry during healing not because they are weak, but because their inner child is finally experiencing emotional safety for the first time, and the body reacts powerfully to safety. Studies on chronic stress show that when individuals escape prolonged emotional tension, cortisol levels begin stabilizing, sleep quality improves, digestion strengthens, inflammation decreases, and cognitive clarity returns. The body starts recovering the moment survival mode ends. That's why so many healed empaths describe feeling physically lighter after leaving toxic relationships. It's not imagination. The nervous system no longer has to scan constantly for emotional danger. For the first time, silence feels peaceful instead of threatening. And then comes the next terrifying stage of healing: anger. Not destructive anger, awakened anger. The empath begins realizing how much they tolerated, how many boundaries were violated, how many times they were manipulated through guilt, how often they abandoned themselves to keep others comfortable. And suddenly, years of suppressed emotion rise to the surface. Psychologists studying trauma recovery discovered that anger often emerges during healing because the brain finally recognizes past violations that were previously normalized for survival. This anger is not regression. It is awareness. The empath is finally seeing the truth clearly, and the truth is painful. Not everyone who needed you loved you. Not everyone who cried in front of you respected you. Not everyone who received your empathy deserved unlimited access to your heart. That realization changes the empath permanently, because healing teaches something childhood never did. Love without boundaries is not love. It is self-erasure. And here's the paradox that shocks many empaths. The healthier they become, the fewer people feel comfortable around them. Why? Because boundaries expose unhealthy dynamics immediately. The empath who once tolerated disrespect suddenly speaks up. The empath who once over-explained suddenly becomes quiet. The empath who once chased people suddenly walks away peacefully. And toxic individuals often react aggressively to this transformation. Research on personal control patterns shows that manipulative personalities frequently resist boundaries because boundaries remove emotional access and control. That's why healing empaths are often called selfish, cold, distant, different, changed. But they are not becoming cruel. They are becoming unavailable for emotional exploitation. And this stage is incredibly lonely at first, because the empath begins outgrowing relationships built entirely around their self-sacrifice. Some friendships disappear. Some family dynamics become strained. Some romantic relationships collapse completely. And for a while, the empath may wonder, was I more lovable when I had no boundaries? That question destroys people internally. But eventually, something beautiful begins happening. The empath stops chasing validation. They stop needing everyone to understand them. They stop explaining every decision. They stop carrying emotional responsibility for grown adults. And slowly, peace enters their life, ways chaos never could. They wake up without dread. Their body relaxes. Their mind becomes quieter. They laugh more naturally. They feel emotionally present instead of emotionally drained. For the first time, they begin living instead of surviving. And perhaps the most powerful transformation of all is this. The empath finally turns their compassion inward. The same kindness they gave strangers, they give themselves. The same patience they offered toxic people, they offer their own healing process. The same understanding they extended to everyone else, they finally extend to the wounded child inside them. And that changes everything. Because healing was never about becoming less empathetic. It was about learning that empathy should not exclude yourself. True healing happens when the empath realizes they are not responsible for saving every broken person they meet. Some people do not want healing. Some people want access. Some people want emotional caretakers. Some people want someone to absorb the consequences of their unresolved trauma. And the empath finally understands. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. That realization creates freedom. Freedom from guilt. Freedom from over-explaining. Freedom from toxic attachment. Freedom from emotional exhaustion. And maybe the most life-changing truth the empath ever learns is this. You do not become selfish when you stop abandoning yourself. You become whole. The child who once believed love required suffering finally grows into someone who understands a deeper truth. Real love feels safe. Real love respects boundaries. Real love does not punish authenticity. Real love allows you to exist without earning your worth through pain. And the moment the empath truly believes that, their entire life begins changing from the inside out.